Bankruptcy doesn't smell like desperation. It smells like expensive Scotch stale cigar smoke and the sharp metallic tang of nervous sweat. The margin calls had hit on a Tuesday. By Thursday morning, the Hayes family, a minor but historically respectable name in Wall Street's secondary circles, was mathematically dead. My father had leveraged everything on a tech merger that evaporated overnight. The threat of federal prison for securities fraud wasn't just a possibility, it was the final neat line waiting at the bottom of our family ledger. Then came the sterling offer. It was delivered not with an engagement ring, but in a mahogany boardroom by 3 lawyers whose custom-tailored suits probably cost more than my annual salary. Richard Sterling, the uncle who now sat on the Iron Throne of the Sterling financial empire, needed a legally binding caretaker for his incapacitated nephew. It wasn't a marriage proposal, it was a corporate acquisition. I was the asset being acquired, and the purchase price was the exact staggering sum required to wipe my family's debts clean and keep my father out of a minimum security cell. We signed the papers in a private room at a Manhattan courthouse. The air conditioning hummed a low-static drone. There were no flowers, no vows, no forced smiles, just the sharp scratch of a Mont Blanc pen against heavy watermarked paper. I signed my name, Julian Hayes. With that single stroke of ink, I was bought. I became a Sterling. The Sterling estate in upstate New York was a fortress of gray stone, wrought iron, and suffocating silence. It didn't smell like a home. It smelled like lemon-scented bleach, old wood, and clinical indifference. As I walked through the grand foyer, the estate staff moved around me like ghosts. Their eyes carefully avoided mine, yet I could feel the weight of their stares. They carried that specific blend of faux politeness and deep-seated contempt reserved for gold diggers and tragic martyrs. I suppose technically I was a bit of both. The head housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Gable with a mouth permanently set in a hard, thin line, led me to the East Wing. "Mr. Sterling is in the master suite," she said, her voice clipped, stripped of any warmth. "He has had his lunch. He is currently having his screen time." She didn't open the door for me. She just turned on her sensible heels and walked away, leaving me standing in the dim corridor. I stood before the heavy oak door for 3 seconds. I adjusted my cuffs. In my head, I calculated my hourly rate based on the debt payoff. It was astronomically high. "You are a forensic accountant," I told myself. "You dissect ruined companies for a living. You find logic in the chaos. This is just a very long, very highly compensated audit." I turned the cool brass handle and pushed the door open. The master bedroom was cavernous, swallowed by shadows despite the afternoon sun trying to pierce the heavy velvet blackout drapes. And there he was, Arthur Sterling. 3 years ago, his face had been on the cover of Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. He was the ruthless, untouchable prodigy, the apex predator of the Eastern Seaboard's financial district. Then came the car crash on a jagged stretch of the coastal cliffs. The official press release had been clinically brutal: permanent traumatic brain injury, irreversible cognitive decline. He was sitting on the floor, right in the center of an antique Persian rug that easily cost more than my entire college tuition. He wore soft gray sweatpants and a white Henley shirt that stretched over broad, relaxed shoulders. His long legs were crossed loosely. He didn't look up when the heavy door clicked shut behind me. He didn't flinch. I walked closer, my leather shoes sinking silently into the thick wool of the rug. Still, no reaction. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from him, looking down. He was holding a pristine white iPad in his large, elegant hands. His eyes, a striking stormy gray, were locked onto the glowing screen. They were entirely vacant. The terrifying, calculating sharpness that used to define Arthur Sterling's public image was completely gone, replaced by a flat, static emptiness. I heard the sound of a tap, a swipe, and a tap. I tilted my head, letting my eyes drop to the screen. It was a farming simulator, bright, obnoxious, pixelated colors. A digital field of radishes. Arthur's index finger moved with slow, methodical repetition. He dragged a digital trowel over a radish. A cheerful chime echoed in the quiet, shadowed room. A cartoon vegetable popped into a cartoon basket. He moved to the next one. A tap, a swipe, and a chime sounded again. He didn't acknowledge my presence. He didn't seem to know I existed. He was a ghost trapped in a meticulously maintained breathing shell, harvesting fake vegetables in a fake world. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the synthetic, cheerful sound effects of the game and the soft, even rhythm of his breathing. I had prepared myself for many things during the 2-hour drive upstate. I had prepared for violence, for sudden tantrums, for the messy, heartbreaking reality of severe cognitive decay. I had braced myself for the physical burden of managing a grown man's shattered mind. But this profound, hollow silence, this complete erasure of a human being, it was worse than chaos. I stood there for a long time. I watched the steady robotic movement of his finger. I watched the way his dark hair fell slightly over his forehead, obscuring a faint, thin white scar near his temple, the only visible physical evidence of the metal and glass that had destroyed him. There was no grand emotional epiphany in my chest, no sudden surge of pity or tragic romance. I am an accountant. I look at what is in front of me, I assess the liabilities, and I balance the sheet. The man sitting on the floor was a zero, a non-entity, and I was his legally appointed keeper. I took a slow breath. The air in the room smelled of expensive laundry detergent and the faint metallic heat of an overworked tablet processor. I reached up and calmly untied my silk tie, pulling it free from my collar. I draped it over the back of a nearby velvet armchair. I unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of my shirt, letting out the tension of the city, of the courthouse, of my ruined family. "All right, Arthur," I said. My voice was quiet, flat, completely devoid of the patronizing, high-pitched warmth people usually use on children or the sick. It was the first human sound to break the room's silence. He didn't blink. Another radish popped into the basket. "This is a job," I murmured to myself, looking down at my new husband. "It pays exceedingly well. I can do this." I walked over to the velvet armchair, sat down, crossed my legs, and settled into the silence to watch him harvest the rest of the field. Routine is the only way to survive a hostile environment. I learned that on Wall Street, and it applied perfectly to the Sterling estate. The staff treated me exactly as I expected, like a highly paid parasite. They were all Richard Sterling's hires, placed here not to care for Arthur, but to contain him. To them, Arthur was a ghost, and I was just the newly hired ghost sitter. The hostility wasn't violent, it was administrative. And the theft was insulting. Not because it was theft, my profession had thoroughly desensitized me to the concept of stolen capital, but because it was mathematically sloppy. By my 3rd day, I noticed the discrepancies. Cheaper, tough cuts of meat, disguised in heavy sauces, generic brand medications swapped into premium bottles, a sudden inexplicable 20% spike in the reported grocery costs. Mrs. Gable and her staff were skimming off the estate's maintenance budget. I didn't yell. Yelling is for amateurs who lack leverage. Instead, I spent a quiet Tuesday morning running a forensic trace on the household accounts. I compiled a beautifully formatted spreadsheet, cross-referencing their padded invoices with real-time wholesale market prices. I calculated the exact thievery down to the penny, $4,218.45 in a single week. When Mrs. Gable brought my lukewarm coffee to the dining room, her mouth in its usual tight line of contempt, I didn't look up from my laptop. I simply turned the screen around to face her. "A fascinating read, Mrs. Gable." I said, my voice smooth and perfectly flat. "I found a $4,218 variance in this week's operational budget. It seems we have a leak." She stopped. Her sensible shoes squeaked slightly on the hardwood. "Now I am a certified forensic accountant," I continued, finally raising my eyes to meet hers. "My last signature put a hedge fund manager in federal prison for a rounding error smaller than this." I let the silence stretch. I watched the color slowly drain from her rigid, pinched face. "I like my coffee hot," I added softly, turning the laptop back to myself. "And I like my ledgers flawless. I trust next week's audit will be exceedingly boring." She didn't say a word. She took the lukewarm cup, her hands trembling faintly, and walked away. The next morning, my coffee was scalding, and the premium medications had miraculously reappeared in the cabinet. I had secured the perimeter. Now I needed to understand the asset. Arthur remained the constant zero in the equation. He spent his days sitting by the tall arched windows of the library, wearing his soft gray sweatpants, tapping at that pristine white iPad. The sounds of a tap, a swipe, and a chime echoed constantly. It was a Thursday afternoon. The sky outside was a bruised purple, unleashing a torrential downpour against the glass. The library was dark, smelling of old paper and rain. I was sitting on the opposite end of the leather Chesterfield sofa, my laptop balanced on my knees. I was monitoring the NASDAQ. It was a bloodbath for the Sterling Empire. Richard Sterling was systematically bleeding the company's subsidiaries, artificially driving down the stock price to trigger a hostile restructuring that would give him absolute control. I watched the red numbers cascade down my screen. Then I looked over at my husband. He was harvesting digital corn. His face was entirely slack eyes reflecting the obnoxious bright colors of the game. I closed my eyes, rubbing my temples. The rhythmic chiming of the app was starting to drill into my skull. I stood up to stretch my legs, walking slowly behind the sofa. I paused, looking down over Arthur's broad shoulder at the pixelated screen. He wasn't harvesting anymore. He was at the game's virtual market selling off bulk inventory. I watched his large thumb move. He sold exactly 14,500 units of virtual timber. My pocket buzzed. I pulled out my phone. A push notification from my Bloomberg app flashed on the lock screen. Sterling Timber and Paper Block trade executed. 14,500 shares shorted. I blinked. I looked down at the iPad. Arthur's finger hovered over a pixelated silo. He tapped. He inputted a custom amount to sell. 8,240 units of wheat. I looked at my phone. I refreshed the live feed. Sterling AgriCorp sell order filled 8,240 shares. The air in the library suddenly felt impossibly thin. My heart executed a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I stepped closer, my shadow falling over his screen. I didn't breathe. Arthur tapped a small red barn icon. He initiated a total liquidation of his southern farm expansion. Every pixelated cow, every digital acre gone in a single swipe. On my laptop screen, sitting on the sofa 3 feet away, a breaking news alert flashed in stark red letters. Sterling Holdings announces immediate liquidation of all Southern manufacturing subsidiaries. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a statistical impossibility. I stared at the side of Arthur's face, at the blank, glassy eyes, at the relaxed, slightly parted lips. He was playing a game, yes, but it wasn't a farming simulator. It was a custom-built, encrypted closed-loop trading terminal masked under the user interface of a toddler's app. And he wasn't just watching the market. He was mathematically, financially, brilliantly awake. The tap swipe and chime continued. He didn't look at me. He didn't flinch. He maintained the perfect, unbroken facade of a shattered mind. That night, the estate was tomb quiet. I stood in the doorway of the master bedroom. Only the faint moonlight spilled across the heavy rug. Arthur was asleep. He lay on his back, the blankets tangled around his waist, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. In the dark, without the vacant stare to distort his features, his face was striking. Sharp jawline, aristocratic nose, the faint white scar adding a dangerous edge to his calm expression. I leaned against the doorframe, feeling the cool wood through my silk pajamas. Slowly, a smile pulled at the corner of my mouth. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of an auditor who had just found the hidden ledger. "You are magnificent," I whispered into the dark. I hadn't married a casualty. I had married a predator playing dead in the tall grass. And, for the first time since my family's bankruptcy, I felt a genuine, thrilling anticipation for tomorrow. A new equilibrium settled over the East Wing. It was a terrifying, exhilarating kind of peace. I no longer viewed my days as babysitting. I was sitting front row at a masterclass in covert corporate warfare. We established a routine of shared, weaponized silence. After breakfast, I would bring my laptop and thick binders of the Sterling Estate's financial history into the library. Arthur would take his usual spot on the sofa iPad, glowing in his hands. We didn't speak, but we were communicating. I decided to run a stress test on my hypothesis. It was a Tuesday late morning. I was reviewing the quarterly reports for Sterling's Western Logistics Division, a massive money pit that Richard Sterling was stubbornly keeping afloat to launder bad debt. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the ceiling, and spoke to the empty room. "The Western fields are severely blighted," I murmured, my tone entirely conversational. "The soil is dead. The cost of fertilizer is far exceeding the crop yield. A smart farmer would burn it to the ground." I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on the ceiling. Across the room, the cheerful, obnoxious music of the farming app chirped, followed by the sound of a tap, a swipe, and a chime. I glanced over. Arthur's thumb had just dragged a digital matchbox icon over a sprawling, pixelated section of wheat on the left side of his screen. The Western plot was instantly replaced by a graphic of smoking, scorched earth. He didn't blink. He just moved on to watering his virtual tomatoes. 4 hours later, my Bloomberg terminal screamed with a breaking alert. Richard Sterling had been forced by an anonymous, massive shareholder proxy vote to immediately liquidate Western Logistics. The stock plummeted, effectively cutting off Richard's largest shadow revenue stream. I looked at the notification, then at the broad shoulders of my husband. He was a sniper, operating through a child's toy, and I was his spotter. But manipulating the NASDAQ was only half of Arthur's capability. The other half was far more localized and significantly more vicious. The estate staff, still emboldened by Richard Sterling's backing, hadn't quite learned their lesson from my spreadsheet. Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper, particularly resented the sudden strictness I had imposed on her kitchen budget. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, she brought Arthur his daily bowl of potato leek soup. She set the silver tray down on the coffee table with a bit too much force. Mr. Sterling's lunch, she clipped, shooting me a dark look before turning to leave. I paused my typing. From my angle, the light caught the rim of the porcelain bowl. There was a faint, chalky white residue near the handle, a minor detail easily missed if you weren't trained to look for discrepancies. Laxatives, mild sedatives. It didn't matter. It was an assault. I stood up, ready to intercept the bowl, ready to drag Mrs. Gable back by her starched collar and threaten her with federal tampering charges. But before I could take a step, Arthur moved. He didn't reach for the soup. He was staring at his iPad. A cartoon beetle was crawling across a prize-winning digital cabbage. Arthur's large thumb hovered over the screen. He didn't just tap it. He pressed down hard, his knuckle turning white, squashing the pixelated bug with a slow, deliberate intensity that made my breath catch. The app emitted a cartoonish sound of a squished bug in defeat. In the exact same moment, Arthur's elbow jerked out clumsily, catching the edge of the silver tray. The heavy porcelain bowl shattered against the hardwood floor, sending the tampered steaming soup splashing across the rug. Arthur returned his hands to his lap, his face a perfect vacant mask of a man who had simply experienced a muscle spasm. I stared at the crushed bug on the screen, then at the ruined soup. I slowly sat back down. "I'll have someone clean that up," I said softly to the air. The real consequence didn't arrive until the next morning. I was pouring my first cup of coffee when the estate manager hurried into the kitchen, looking pale and deeply rattled. "Mrs. Gable won't be coming in," he announced to the staff. "She had an accident last night, slipped on the main staircase, fractured her right radius in 3 places. The paramedics said it was a nasty fall." I took a slow sip of my black coffee. I walked out to the main foyer and looked at the grand sweeping staircase. The marble was bone dry. The heavy anti-slip carpet runner was perfectly secured. It was a physical impossibility to slip there unless you were violently pushed. A cold thrill shivered down my spine. The farming game wasn't just a trading terminal, it was a voodoo doll, a command center for a network of invisible ghosts Arthur had operating within the estate. He wasn't a victim trapped in a tower. He was a spider sitting dead center in a massive unseen web, and anyone who touched his web lost a limb. I realized then, with a profound, twisted sense of comfort, that I was the safest person on the eastern seaboard. That afternoon, I walked into the library. The rain had stopped, leaving the room bathed in a cool gray light. Arthur was in his usual spot, the ghost in the sweatpants. I didn't bring my laptop. I brought a single porcelain teacup on a saucer. I walked over to the Chesterfield sofa. I didn't say a word. I simply placed the teacup on the small side table exactly 3 inches from his iPad. It was sencha green tea. I had brewed the water to precisely 175 degrees Fahrenheit, the exact temperature required so as not to burn the leaves. No sugar, no milk, perfect bitter, and intensely hot. I stood there, my hands tucked into the pockets of my tailored trousers, looking down at him. For 10 seconds, nothing happened except the sound of tapping, swiping, and chiming. Then the tapping stopped. Arthur's thumb rested on the edge of the glass. The cheerful music played on, ignoring the sudden heavy gravity in the room. Slowly, deliberately, Arthur turned his head. He looked up at me. The dense gray fog that had clouded his eyes for 3 years evaporated. His pupils focused, locking onto mine with the sharpness of shattered glass. There was no vacancy. There was only a terrifying, calculating, brilliant intellect staring back at me, assessing me, weighing my worth. He didn't smile. He reached out with a steady hand, his long fingers wrapping elegantly around the delicate porcelain teacup. He brought it to his lips, took a slow sip, and set it back down. He held my gaze. The silence in the room was deafening. "Good," he said. His voice was a low, dark gravel. The first word I had ever heard him speak. A shiver of absolute electricity shot straight to my core. I gave him a slow, shallow nod, a subordinate acknowledging a king, and walked back to my desk. The game was on. Dinner with Richard Sterling felt less like a familial gathering and more like a hostile corporate takeover, albeit with better silverware and a roast lamb centerpiece. He arrived at 7 o'clock sharp, bringing the cold autumn air and 2 men in immaculate Brioni suits with him. They weren't family friends. They carried thin leather briefcases and had the dead, calculating eyes of men who billed $1,000 an hour to legally ruin people. Arthur sat at my right wearing a perfectly pressed navy blazer. He looked devastatingly handsome and completely, utterly vacant. He was currently using his silver oyster fork to meticulously build a small tower out of his peas. "It really is tragic," Julian, Richard said, swirling his Cabernet. He didn't look at me. He was watching Arthur's pea tower with thinly veiled disgust. "To see a mind like that reduced to, well, a breathing vessel, I commend your patience, I truly do. It must be exhausting babysitting a ghost." I sliced my lamb, the serrated knife scraping softly against the bone china. "Arthur is exceptionally quiet, Richard. In my experience, silence is vastly preferable to the alternative." Richard offered a tight, patronizing smile. He set his wine glass down. The pleasantries, it seemed, were over. He nodded to the lawyer on his left. The man opened his briefcase and produced a thick stack of documents, sliding them across the polished mahogany table until they rested directly next to Arthur's plate. On top was a small black ink pad. "We are all practical men here, Julian," Richard said, his voice dropping into a smooth, practiced baritone. "The estate is vast. The subsidiaries are complex. It is too much of a burden for you to manage alone, and Arthur is obviously incapable. This is a standard irrevocable power of attorney. It transfers permanent voting rights and asset management to the board to me. It protects Arthur. It protects you." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "All we need is his thumbprint on the dotted line. A formality." Arthur didn't react. He picked up another pea. "A formality," I repeated smoothly. I set my knife down and reached across Arthur, pulling the thick stack of papers toward me. "Julian, those are legal documents," the lead lawyer warned, his voice sharp. "I am aware," I replied, not looking up as I flipped past the cover page. "I am also a certified forensic accountant. I don't sign standard delivery receipts without reading the fine print, let alone a total asset forfeiture disguised as a guardianship transfer." The room grew very still. I scanned the pages, my eyes tracking the dense legalese with the speed of a man who used to dismantle hedge fund portfolios for breakfast. "Fascinating," I murmured after 30 seconds. I looked up, locking eyes with the lead lawyer. Clause 4B, paragraph 3. Complete and unmitigated transfer of all liquid assets to Sterling Holdings' secondary accounts, bypassing the family trust. That's not a management clause. That's a liquidation order. The lawyer shifted slightly in his chair. "You are misinterpreting the terminology, Mr. Hayes. It is standard operational protocol for in a year we do your Friday. Save it." I cut him off, my voice dropping to a low glacial register. I tossed the contract back onto the center of the table. Clause 7 nullifies my spousal authority upon execution. Clause 9 grants Richard the right to relocate Arthur to a specialized medical facility of the board's choosing. This isn't a power of attorney. This is a legally sanctioned kidnapping and a corporate looting. Richard's face darkened. The veneer of the concerned uncle vanished, replaced by the apex predator who had driven my father to bankruptcy. "Listen to me, you little upstart," he snarled. "You were bought. You are a paid babysitter. You do not have the clearance, the pedigree, or the power to interfere with Sterling business. I am his legally bonded spouse." I replied, my voice perfectly flat, entirely devoid of fear. I leaned back in my chair. "And as long as my name is on that marriage certificate, not a single penny of Arthur's equity moves without my signature. If you want this ink pad used, Richard, you will have to cut off Arthur's hand to get it. And I assure you, I will make the subsequent audit so bloody, the SEC will be dissecting your offshore accounts for the next decade." The silence that followed was suffocating. Richard stared at me, his face an apoplectic mask of rage, but I barely registered his fury. Because right then, hidden beneath the heavy floor-length linen tablecloth, something moved. A large warm hand wrapped around my left wrist. It wasn't a loose accidental brush. It was a vice-like grip. Arthur's long fingers pressed firmly into my pulse point. The grip was steady grounding and shockingly powerful. It was the physical manifestation of the intellect I had seen in the library. I am here. I am awake. I have you. My breath hitched imperceptibly. Above the table, Arthur was still staring blankly at his peas. Below the table, he was anchoring me to the earth. "This isn't over, Julian," Richard hissed, standing up so abruptly his heavy chair scraped against the hardwood. "You are playing a game you cannot possibly win." "Have a safe drive back to the city, Richard," I said smoothly. The lawyers scrambled to gather the UN thumb-printed documents. Within 2 minutes, the front door slammed shut. The heavy silence of the estate rushed back in, broken only by the sound of tires crunching angrily down the gravel driveway. I sat at the table, my heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Slowly, the grip on my wrist released. I turned my head. Arthur wasn't looking at his peas anymore. He placed his oyster fork neatly on the edge of his plate. He didn't look blank. He looked like a storm about to break. He stood up. There was no shuffling. There was no slack in his posture. He rose to his full, imposing height of 6'2". His broad shoulders squared, his movements fluid and lethally precise. The ghost was entirely gone. He looked down at me, his gray eyes dark and impossibly sharp. "Come with me," he said. His voice was a low, resonant command that left absolutely no room for negotiation. He turned and walked out of the dining room. I stood up, my pulse racing, and followed the man I had married into the library. Arthur walked past the Chesterfields, past his usual spot by the window. He waited until I stepped completely inside the room. Then he reached out, grabbed the heavy brass handle of the oak door, and pushed it shut. The heavy lock engaged with a sharp click. He turned the lock. The game of hide and seek was officially over. The click of the heavy brass lock echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous library. Arthur didn't move immediately. He stood with his back to me, his broad shoulders rising and falling with a slow, controlled breath. The afternoon rain had returned, drumming a relentless heavy rhythm against the tall, arched windows. When he finally turned around, the air in the room seemed to compress. For 3 weeks, I had lived with a ghost, but the man standing before me now was a titan. He moved toward the heavy mahogany desk in the center of the room, every step deliberate, projecting a quiet, lethal authority. He didn't sit. He unlocked the bottom drawer of the desk, a drawer I had previously determined was empty. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound dossier and a small slip of watermarked paper. He set them on the edge of the desk, pushing them exactly 2 inches in my direction. 3 years, Arthur said. His voice was a revelation. It wasn't the rusty, unused croak of a convalescent. It was deep, resonant, and coated in gravel. It was the voice of a man who used to order corporate liquidations before his morning espresso. I walked closer, my eyes dropping to the desk. The slip of paper was a certified cashier's check, issued from a Cayman Islands shell company, made out to Julian Hayes, $10 million. The dossier contains 47 distinct counts of federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit murder, all bearing Richard's direct signature. Arthur continued, his tone clinical. "I have spent 36 months building an airtight cage. The board meeting is in 2 weeks. When I drop this on the table, Richard will not just lose the company, he will die in a federal penitentiary." I looked from the check to his face. His gray eyes were entirely focused, reading my micro-expressions. "But Richard is a cornered animal," Arthur said, taking a step closer. The sheer physical presence of him was overwhelming. "He suspected I was recovering. Tonight you confirmed to him that I have an asset. You humiliated his legal team. He will not retaliate with paperwork, Julian. He uses mercenaries. It is no longer safe for you on this estate." He tapped the $10 million check with a long, elegant finger. "Your family's debts are cleared. This is your severance. Your contract is fulfilled. There is a car waiting at the service entrance. It will take you to Teterboro, where a private jet is fueled and ready to fly you to London. Leave now." It was a perfectly rational, highly logical exit strategy. It was exactly what a sane, self-preserving accountant should take. I looked at the check. Then I looked up at my husband. Slowly, I reached out. I didn't touch the check. I bypassed it entirely, my hand closing over the pristine white iPad resting on the corner of the desk. Arthur's eyes narrowed slightly. I unlocked the screen. The farming simulator was open. A sprawling, pixelated field of red wheat was waiting to be harvested. It was the visual representation of Richard's offshore holding accounts. I held Arthur's gaze. My pulse was a frantic drumbeat in my throat, but my hands were completely terrifyingly steady. "I don't think you understand who you married, Arthur," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous whisper. I pressed my thumb against the screen. I dragged the digital scythe across the entire field. 3 bright chimes rang out in succession. The red wheat vanished. The offshore accounts were zeroed out. I tossed the iPad back onto the desk. It landed with a sharp clatter next to the check. "I am a forensic accountant," I said, stepping directly into his personal space, closing the physical gap until we were inches apart. I had to tilt my head up to maintain eye contact. "I don't abandon an audit halfway through. I don't run from cheap thugs in tailored suits. And I am the lead auditor on this estate. I am the one who decides when the ledger is officially closed." I reached down, picked up the $10 million check, and calmly tore it precisely in half. I dropped the pieces onto the mahogany wood. "I am not going to London," I stated softly. "I am staying right here, and we are going to bury your uncle together." Arthur stared at me. The calculating machinery behind his gray eyes halted. For the first time since I had met him, Arthur Sterling looked genuinely, profoundly stunned. Then the shock melted. What replaced it was a look of such intense, ravenous possession that my breath caught in my lungs. He didn't say another word. He didn't need to. His large hands came up, framing my jaw with a grip that was entirely unyielding. He pulled me in. The kiss wasn't a tentative exploration, it was a collision. It was bruising, desperate, and heavily intoxicating. It tasted of bitter green tea and absolute power. I grabbed the lapels of his Henley shirt, anchoring myself to him as the last remnants of our professional boundaries incinerated. It was a pact sealed in the dark, an acknowledgement that we were 2 predators perfectly matched for the slaughter ahead. When he finally pulled back, his forehead rested against mine. He was breathing heavily, his thumbs stroking my cheekbones. "Okay," Arthur murmured, his voice a dark rumble against my skin. "We bury him together." The physical proof of our new alliance arrived less than 12 hours later. The following morning, I took my own sedan into the city under the guise of picking up specialty coffee for the estate. I knew I was being followed. The black SUV had been tailing me since I merged onto the interstate. Richard's men. I didn't panic. I put on a Chopin prelude, set my cruise control, and took a sip of my travel mug. As I approached the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, a massive, unmarked garbage truck merged aggressively from the left lane. It didn't brake. I watched in my rearview mirror as the truck seamlessly, ruthlessly broadsided the black SUV. The sound of crunching metal and shattered glass echoed over the highway as the SUV was pinned violently against the concrete median. The truck didn't stop. It simply backed up, shifted gears, and disappeared down the off-ramp into the labyrinth of Brooklyn. I didn't flinch. I took another slow sip of my coffee, adjusted the volume on the Chopin, and continued driving. The ghost was officially awake, and he was watching my back. The 65th floor of Sterling Tower smelled of ozone espresso and anticipated victory. The emergency shareholder meeting was held in the grand boardroom, a cavernous space of glass and steel, suspended high above the Manhattan skyline. The long mahogany table was surrounded by the board of directors, men and women in dark suits who possessed the collective morality of a shark tank. At the head of the table sat Richard Sterling. He looked relaxed, radiant, even a man mere seconds away from officially crowning himself king. I was not in the room. I was standing in the corridor outside, my back pressed against the cool marble wall, holding my matte black laptop tight against my chest. Next to me stood Arthur. He was not wearing gray sweatpants. He was dressed in a midnight blue bespoke Tom Ford suit that cut a devastatingly sharp silhouette. His dark hair was immaculately styled, pushing back from his face to fully expose the faint white scar near his temple. He didn't look like a recovering patient. He looked like an apex predator returning to a territory that had foolishly forgotten his name. From inside the boardroom, the muffled sound of a microphone engaging echoed through the heavy oak double doors. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard's smooth, practiced baritone rang out. "We are gathered today to rectify a tragedy. For 3 years, Sterling Holdings has operated under a cloud of uncertainty regarding my nephew's unfortunate condition. Today, we execute the medical proxy, permanently transferring his voting rights to this board, ensuring the future." Arthur didn't wait for him to finish. He reached out and pushed both heavy oak doors open simultaneously. They hit the stops with a resounding, violent sound of a crack that echoed like thunder across the boardroom. The silence that instantly fell over the room was absolute. 50 heads snapped toward the entrance. Arthur walked in. He didn't shuffle. He didn't hesitate. He conquered the distance with long, lethal, unhurried strides. The sheer gravitational pull of his presence sucked the oxygen out of the room. Board members physically recoiled in their expensive leather chairs as he passed them. I followed exactly 2 paces behind him, my face a carefully constructed mask of professional indifference. We reached the head of the table. Richard had frozen half standing out of his chair, the color draining from his face so rapidly he looked like a wax corpse. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. "You're in my chair, Richard," Arthur said. His voice, deep, gravelly, and echoing with absolute authority, sent a visible shockwave through the room. Several board members gasped. The ghost was not only awake, he was speaking, and he sounded like the Grim Reaper. Richard's eyes darted frantically. "Arthur, you are medically unfit. Security, get security in here immediately. This is a breach." "Security works for the man who signs their paychecks," I interrupted smoothly, stepping forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with my husband. "And as of 8 o'clock this morning, all operational payroll has been successfully routed back to Arthur's primary authorization." I didn't wait for Richard to recover. I slammed my laptop down onto the mahogany table directly in front of the master projection console. I plugged in the HDMI cable. The massive 60-inch screens covering the far wall flickered to life. The board members stared in utter confusion. I hadn't loaded a PowerPoint. The screens were displaying the bright, pixelated, obnoxious interface of a farming simulator. A little cartoon cow chewed cud in the corner. "What is this absolute joke?" Richard snarled, regaining a fraction of his bravado. "Are you showing us his toys? Is this your proof of his sanity, Julian?" "No, Richard," I replied, my voice dropping to the glacial, terrifying register of an auditor closing a trap. "I'm showing you the murder weapon." I hit the enter key. The cheerful user interface of the farming game instantly fragmented. The pixelated cows and red wheat fields dissolved into a cascading waterfall of hexadecimal code. Within 3 seconds, the code snapped into a perfectly structured, undeniably damning financial ledger. Over the past 36 months, I announced my voice carrying cleanly across the dead silent room. Arthur Sterling has utilized a closed-loop custom encrypted trading terminal masked as an iOS application. From that terminal, we have meticulously tracked every single illicit shadow transaction processed by this board. I tapped a key. The screen zoomed in on a specific series of offshore accounts. "Here," I said, pointing a laser pen at the screen, "we have 42 instances of wire fraud funneling corporate assets into Cayman shell companies owned by Richard Sterling." I tapped another key. "Here we have documented evidence of artificial market manipulation to short Sterling AgriCorp." I paused, letting the silence hang heavy before delivering the killing blow. "And here," I said softly, pulling up a scanned handwritten routing slip, "is the receipt for a $5 million wire transfer to a private security firm dated 3 days before Arthur's car accident." The memo line reads, "Brake line maintenance." The boardroom erupted. It was pandemonium. Directors were shouting, pushing their chairs back desperately, trying to distance themselves from Richard. Richard lunged across the table toward me, his face twisted in a mask of pure, cornered rage. But he never made it. Arthur caught him by the throat with one hand, lifting him slightly off his feet before shoving him violently backward into the heavy leather chair. "You're done, Richard," Arthur said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. As if on cue, the secondary doors at the back of the room burst open. 6 federal agents in dark windbreakers emblazoned with FBI stormed into the room, followed closely by 2 federal prosecutors I had quietly emailed the decrypted ledgers to at midnight. Richard Sterling, the lead agent, barked over the chaos. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, corporate fraud, and racketeering." Flashbulbs began to detonate outside the glass walls as the press, who had been tipped off 15 minutes prior, swarmed the perimeter. The noise was deafening. Board members were shouting for their lawyers. Handcuffs clicked sharply onto Richard's wrists. The apex predator of the eastern seaboard was being publicly, ruthlessly butchered. Through it all, Arthur didn't look at his uncle. He didn't look at the FBI. He didn't look at the flashing cameras. He turned slowly, entirely unbothered by the hurricane of chaos tearing through the room, and looked at me. His gray eyes were soft, shedding the lethal calculation that had defined them for 3 years. He took a step closer, closing the distance between us until we were in our own private, untouchable orbit amidst the madness. He reached up. His large, warm hands gently grasped the lapels of my tailored suit. He meticulously, needlessly adjusted my collar, his thumbs grazing the pulse point at my throat. "The farm is completely cleared of weeds," Arthur murmured, his deep voice meant only for my ears, cutting right through the shouting of the federal agents. He looked down at me, a faint, devastatingly handsome smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. It's time for the real owner to move in. The complete forensic audit of Richard Sterling's Shadow Empire took exactly 6 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days. I know this because I was the one who handed the final 2,000-page consolidated ledger to the lead prosecutor of the SEC. The federal investigators were initially skeptical of a 24-year-old taking point on the most complex corporate fraud case of the decade. That skepticism lasted exactly 45 minutes into our first briefing, after which they stopped questioning my methodology and simply started taking very frantic notes. Richard Sterling did not go to trial, faced with a mountain of impeccably structured, irrefutable digital evidence and a half dozen of his own board members scrambling to testify against him for reduced sentences. He took a plea deal. 25 years in a federal penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. The day the judge struck the gavel, Arthur and I did not celebrate with champagne. We simply went home. But home was no longer the suffocating stone fortress in upstate New York. That estate belonged to a ghost. It belonged to the heavy velvet drapes, the bitter tea, and the endless, weaponized silence. The week after the boardroom massacre, Arthur ordered the immediate sale of the property, entirely liquidating the contents. I only kept 2 things, my laptop and the pristine white iPad. Our new residence was a sprawling modern architectural marvel in the Hamptons. It was all floor-to-ceiling, glass, pale cedar wood, and open air. It smelled of sea salt, fresh linen, and unfiltered sunlight. There were no dark corridors. There were no shadows to hide in. We hired a completely new household staff professionals who were paid exceptionally well and who looked at Arthur not with contempt, but with a healthy, respectful dose of absolute terror, because the apex predator was officially back. Wall Street had spent 3 years mourning the loss of its most ruthless prodigy. His return was nothing short of seismic. Within a month, Arthur had systematically purged the Sterling Holdings executive suite, installed his own loyalists, and ruthlessly acquired 3 competing firms that had foolishly tried to capitalize on the chaos. He wore his bespoke suits like armor. He commanded boardrooms with a dark, resonant authority that made grown men sweat through their expensive shirts. But that was in the city. That was for the rest of the world. Here at the edge of the Atlantic, the predator was remarkably completely tame. It was a late Sunday morning in mid-August. The ocean breeze was blowing through the open glass doors of the master suite balcony. I was sitting on a plush, oversized linen sofa dressed in loose white trousers and a soft cashmere sweater, a physical rejection of the tailored suits that used to define my survival. I was reading a hardcover book, a genuine fictional novel, not a quarterly earnings report. I heard the soft, familiar sound of bare feet on the hardwood floor. I didn't look up from my page as Arthur walked out onto the balcony. He was wearing soft gray sweatpants and a white Henley, an echo of the ghost I had met a year ago. But the energy he carried was vastly different. There was no slack in his posture, no vacancy in his stunning gray eyes. He looked relaxed, radiant, and devastatingly handsome in the morning light. He didn't sit on the empty armchair across from me. He never did anymore. Instead, Arthur lowered his imposing frame onto the sofa, stretched his long legs out, and casually rested his heavy head directly onto my lap. I smoothly lifted my book to accommodate him, my left hand instinctively dropping down to run through his dark, thick hair. He let out a low, gravelly hum of contentment, shifting slightly until he found the perfect angle against my thigh. For a long moment, the only sound was the crashing of the waves against the shoreline. Then I heard it. I heard the sound of a tap, a swipe, and a chime. I paused my reading. I looked down. Resting on Arthur's broad chest was the pristine white iPad. The cheerful, obnoxious interface of the farming simulator was glowing brightly in the sunlight. I watched his long, elegant thumb drag a digital trowel across a pixelated patch of dirt. "Are we shorting the agricultural sector again?" I asked, my voice dry, though a small smile pulled at the corner of my mouth. "Because I haven't prepared the offshore routing algorithms for a Sunday liquidation." Arthur didn't look up from the screen. "No," he murmured, his voice a deep, soothing rumble vibrating against my legs. "The market is closed, Julian." "Then what exactly are you doing?" A tap, a swipe, and a chime sounded again. "I am planting roses," Arthur replied seamlessly. I stared at the screen. A row of bright red cartoonish flowers popped up in the virtual dirt. There is absolutely zero return on investment for virtual roses, Arthur, I pointed out, tapping the edge of the iPad with my index finger. They don't yield tradable commodities. It is a statistically inefficient use of digital acreage. Arthur finally stopped tapping. He locked the screen, tossing the iPad onto the glass coffee table. He turned his head, looking up at me. The gray fog was entirely gone, replaced by a gaze so intensely warm and fiercely possessive, it still made my pulse skip a beat. He reached up his large hand, wrapping gently around the back of my neck, pulling me down a fraction of an inch. The ROI, Arthur said softly, his thumb brushing my cheekbone, is that I like them. And I like the man sitting in my garden. I held his gaze. The calculating machinery in my head, the part of me that was constantly assessing liabilities and balancing the sheet, completely powered down. I reached over to the small porcelain bowl on the side table, picked up a cold green grape, and calmly popped it into his mouth. Arthur smiled, a genuine devastating curve of his lips, and closed his eyes, settling deeper into my lap. I leaned back, resting my head against the sofa, and listened to the ocean. I thought about my father's bankruptcy. I thought about the cold Manhattan courthouse, the scratch of the Mont Blanc pen, and the staggering sum of money that had purchased my life. I had walked into a fortress of ghosts expecting to be a highly paid casualty. I had expected to spend my life managing a zero. Instead, I had found the hidden ledger. I had found the only man in the world capable of matching my exact frequency in the dark. I looked down at the Titan resting on my lap, entirely at my mercy, entirely mine. The audit was officially closed, and the balance was absolutely perfect.